Let's talk about Lumen Terminal Pro and see how it would perform in a pro photo and video workflow that goes beyond just MDR. Praise here. Let's talk about Mac Studio. Top M4 Mac Silicon, comparing this with the base M3 Ultra Silicon to see if the upgrade is worth it or not for a pro photo and video workflow. Let's jump right in. I'm ArtIsRight. As usual, I'll be sharing lots of information. Please pause this video so you can analyze the result yourself in addition to the analysis I'll be sharing with you. Timestamp to the various tests will be in the description, although it may not be available when the video launch. This channel is fully self-funded. If you find information helpful, you want to help support this channel, I'll leave a link to my tip jar in the description. YouTube Super Thanks works. You can also join the channel membership. And when appropriate, please share this video with your colleagues that you know that are looking for these machines, because I think this information is going to be helpful to them too. And if the only thing that you can do is tapping on that like button, this way YouTube algorithm will push this to a larger audience, and subscribe if you haven't yet so we can grow the channel, that's perfectly fine with me. And I thank you all for watching these videos. Lastly, remember this is a one-person show, so please be kind in the comments. Now, this is going to be a redacted video that compares mostly the two machines that I mentioned in the beginning. If you want to see the full result with a compilation for all the laptop and the previous generation machine and so forth, I'll leave a link to my full comparison video that I made in the description. I highly recommend that you watch that, maybe after you watch this one, to get a better idea. And even though this video is a little bit late in the game, I figure I would just complete this entire M4 generation series desktop for the Mac Studio. Now for this one, we're going to be focusing on these two machines. So the top M4 Max and the base M3 Ultra. A couple things about this is my machine, I upgrade this to 256 from the 96 gigabytes of memory base. And you can technically upgrade the M4 Max top silicon to 128 gigabytes of memory. Now we're going to see really clearly where some tasks just go in and utilize CPU and GPU, and adding more memory to it, it's not really going to do much in terms of speeding the task up. And if you note in all of my slides and everything, I also put down at the very top too, which resources that particular task is utilizing on the system. But there's a couple of other things I do want to talk about before we jump and continue on to the other machine in the lineup. So let's take a look at, not Terminal Pro, but we're going to take a look at these two machines in comparison. So the M4 Max and the M3 Ultra. Now you see the price point there, and I think they're fairly interesting, but when we start to go and configure them, let's start with the M3 Ultra, 96 gigabytes of memory. We're going to start with the base silicon because we're comparing this one and 1 terabyte SSD. If we start to do this on the M4 Max and get it to within spec of each other, for instance, we upgrade this to top M4 Max because we want to get more memory on the system. And let's say we bump this up all the way to 128. I wish it would be great if the memory was on parity with each other, meaning that you can configure 96 and you can also configure, for instance, like 128 on the Ultra, but that's not the case this time around, but we're going to go forward with it. But now that you've seen these two in comparison, and we're going to also add SSD, you are now looking at a price delta of just $300. So I want us to keep that in mind as well, that if we start to build everything that is about equivalent, do you get more out of an M3 Ultra that way, or are you better off with just the Max when it's only a price delta of $300? All right, so let's jump back in and continue on with the other machines in the lineup that we have. Now, I'll also include the other machines too, but the other conversation that we need to have when we talk about Max versus Ultra has to do with the media engine. Max have pretty much doubled the media engine compared to a Pro and a regular silicon, but the Ultra has doubled that of a Max. So instead of having 2, now you have 4 cores. So you're going to see the video tasks and everything, the rendering is much faster. Although one downside is, and you're going to see this a lot in the Final Cut slide I'll show later on, is that the M3 Ultra is still using the previous generation afterburner or rendering engine. So it's not really as fast as the M4 generation engine. And I'll show that to you in a task later on. So these are some of the other Macs you're going to see as well, M2 Max, M1, and also M2 Ultra, and I'll also have the M4 Pro in there for reference too. Configuration and buyer guides will be towards the end. And remember, when it comes to these silicons with Apple, there are 2 segmentation. One's more consumer leaning, the other one's more pro. Because we're testing all the pro oriented one, I'm not going to spend too much time on here, but it's worthwhile getting a pro oriented silicon. Now, upgrade priority. To really get the most performance per dollar that you can really spend, it has always been memory. Next thing up would be like the chipset family, because now they're tied in with each other. If you have extra money left, SSD would be a good point to consider. And then lastly would be the chip variants. This would be going in, for example, upgrading from the base M4 Max to the top M4 Max silicon. And when I'm talking about base and top, I'm just talking about the silicon, just to be clear on that one. So the justification for upgrading and buying all these things would ultimately depend on where you are. For example, I've been doing this creative career for 20 plus years now. I want to have the fastest machine possible. Saving, for instance, with $300 price difference that I talked about before, a few minutes from my workflow, having it be faster, it's totally worth it for me. It may not be the same kind of predicament, the same justification if you're just starting out. So think about where you are in your career as well, in addition to all the other factors that I am about to share with you. So I'll be taking a pro perspective on this, and we're going to be doing single silicon testing. Despite naysayers out there that saying like these tests are invalidated, I'm still going to do what I'm going to do because I still think majority of us are finding values out of these tests. There are many other configurations out there. I can't test everything. If you happen to live in SoCal area and you max out an M4 Max and you want to give me a few hours on your machine, I would love to test on those. So I've also run some reference and comparative testing because the OS has been upgraded and also the software has been upgraded. Timing wise, it's about the same for all these operating systems, so we're good to go. Optimization, we're getting much better, but I don't think we're fully there yet. We're still using a lot of brute force to go through this. So the design in Max Studio, it's pretty much like just the same. Just something to note between the Max and the Ultra is that the front two ports on the Ultra is a Thunderbolt 5. On the Max, it's pretty much just a USB-C, so just something to think about there. Fan-wise, Ultra is running much more silence when I'm throwing all these tasks in, whereas the Max, the fan would start to ramp up, and you do hear the fan running a little bit, not quite as loud as the Mac Mini M4 Pro, but it does run louder than relative to the Ultra, which is pretty much silenced. And with this in the latest OS upgrade, Apple have also gone in and add in low power mode, so you can set this way the machine won't ramp up the fan quite as high and will run, I think, at a lower frequency too. I haven't done testing on this because I don't really need to be in a quiet environment other than when I'm filming, but when I'm actually doing work, I'm just working and I'm not doing sound recording, so I'm good there. But if you want to, you can certainly set the computers in those mode and it will definitely help out. Now, calibration have passed with both hardware and software calibration, so you're good to go and get good colors on day one. My recommendation is always, if you're getting these set up as a new machine, especially if you're coming from an Intel generation and you are a Creative Pro, it's just nicer to start out fresh. Here's how you will read the specs on all of these machines. And quickly, let's talk about SSD. When it comes to these, they're pretty much mighty fast. You can upgrade to a larger SSD to get more speed, but you have to ask yourself, what's really the point of that beyond just ingress and egress of files? Like, you can download files faster from memory cards and so forth, but at a certain point, you're going to start to max out those speeds. So just something to think about there. I've also made a video talking about like the overall speed and as far as the program, can they use it or not? And the answer to that is no. I'll leave a link to this video in the description. It's pretty much a good reality check on just trying to pursue like the fastest technology possible. Let's talk about RAM. Now with RAM, unlike an SSD, you cannot expand this. It's pretty much locked into the system. So think about how much you're going to need and configure as much as you think you're going to use or keep the machine into the future. Now, the best way to really determine how much RAM you have, especially if you have a Mac right now, is I would restart the system. Start out fresh, go through your workflow, just go through your normal day. If you open Safari up and have too many tabs open, do that. And I would just launch Activity Monitor, go into the memory tab and take a look at the memory pressure. If you're green, you're pretty much good with the amount of memory you have. If you're kind of like in the yellow or the red, you probably want to get more memory in your system. Now, one thing that I will say is, for example, if you have 128 right now going down to 96, probably not going to make that big of a deal. However, if you have 30 something like 32 and you're going down to 16 or 36 going down to 18, you are going to feel much more of that crunch at the lower end than at the higher end. Another app that I use to keep track of all this is iStat Menu 7. I'll have links to this in the description also, but you can go and take a look at the memory pressure going back like 28 days. I love this program. I'm not paid by them, but it's really a cool program that I use. One thing that I've noted in all of my testing is that there has been a lot of a slowing down trend, so just something that I want to point out. Now let's take a look at Lightroom Classic 14.2 to support full acceleration. When we take a look at this and we take a look at the price tag, now the machine that I have, it's upgraded to 256 gigabytes of memory, so it is priced higher. But if we consider just the base configuration at $39.99 compared to this at $24.99, you're talking about close to about a 4-minute roughly time variation there. But another thing to note too is that when you start to bump up the price, right, you can add more RAM in the system here. This is a task that use CPU only. So RAM is going to make very little bearing in terms of the overall time. This is a brute force CPU usage case. And when it comes to this, if you're thinking about upgrading the Max all the way so that it's as close as possible to the Ultra, I would say that the $300 price upgrade at that point, it's totally worth it. I think it is justifiable if you're going to upgrade your machine. However, if you're going to run stock, you really have to ask yourself if that 4 minutes is worth it or not. But let's continue to see how the other machine would perform and how the other tasks would perform. Here are the rest of the desktop in a lineup, and you can see how they're spreading out. The Ultra tends to come up at the very top on these tasks, although the M1 is a little bit slower than the M4 Max top silicon at this point. And here are the rest of the other machines in the lineup for your consideration. Now for Export 1K, we are talking about a little bit over a minute variation. Most of these tasks, by the way, that I want to mention is that they are running under a single digit time, meaning that they're not even reaching the 10-minute mark. So you really have to ask yourself if spending the extra money is worth it or not. So for this, at this price range, I think the M4 Max is a really great value. However, if you're going to upgrade all the way, I would just spend a little extra $300 and upgrade to this machine, and I think you're going to get that much more out of the machine also. And I understand that we're talking about 128 versus 96 gigabytes of memory, but again, I still think you're going to see much more benefit from going to an Ultra if you're going to max out your machine already. Now, with this said, this is a task that uses CPU and GPU. RAM plays very little role in this, and because we have so much of it anyway, we're pretty much good to go on this one. How does this compare with the rest of the other machine in the lineup? A couple of things I do want to point out in this one is that the M4 Pro is performing last because it has the least amount of GPU cores compared to any of these other machines that I'm testing. This is a task where having the number of cores does matter. So what about in HDR merge? So for this one, timing is really close to each other, although the M3 Ultra generation is showing some sign of like slowdown. It's not really a slowdown if you really think about it, because this is just using a single core CPU, and this is using a previous generation architecture. So now we're seeing that slight slowdown in speed, and that's because of the architecture and the frequency that it can really run at. Overall, is this going to make a big difference? I would say not so much, but you can see how the timing spread there. And if you take a look at this, all of these are grouped by machine generations. You can see that there. So these are based on the architecture and how fast those single cores can run, more so than the number of cores that there are on the system. What about Panorama? This is a task that relies on CPU and RAM. So when we try to do a merge like this together, this task is benefiting from the extra RAM in the system. It's also benefiting from the extra CPU core they can run as well. This is why we're seeing a significant time jump between these two, or time variations. To prove this, where CPU and RAM makes a difference, take a look at the amount of RAM in the system and also the generation of CPUs. You can see that there, how, sometimes having a little bit more is really not giving that much more benefit comparing to, having a machine that has more CPU in this task. I think this particular two lines here really give us a good perspective into all of this, and you can see the rest of the machine there. AI noise reduction for a single file. This is something that's supposed to be running on the NPU. However, there are some issues, so it's running on the GPU right now. And with this, because there are multiple cores, there are more cores of GPU, you start to see the time reduction here. So the Ultra is pulling up ahead. And remember, like I said, if you're upgrading your Max all the way, you're talking about $300 price delta. I think the Ultra is looking really good for these particular tasks. These are the timing for the rest of the machine. Because this is AI reduction for just one file, what happened if we do it to 10 of them? How much benefit are we going to see? So let's take a look. With this, we are seeing not even a minute, more like 30 seconds time improvement, a little bit over that. But you got to really think about this. If you're doing to more than 10 files, these things start to add up. And how fast do you want to finish will be one of the main questions. Overall, I would probably say if you're going to configure these stock machines the way how they are, upgrading it is definitely not worth the price for that 30 seconds. However, if you're already going to bump up the max silicon so that it is as close as possible on the memory and the SSD to the Ultra, then jumping to the Ultra, that extra $300 is now going to gain you a little bit extra, not in this task, but also in other tasks as well. How does this compare with the rest of the lineup? You can start to see that there, and also the M4 Pro is starting to lag behind a little bit. It's still in a single digit, but it is starting to lag behind because there are less GPU cores on the system. What about AI Sky and subject masking? So with this, timing on the M4 Max is much faster. The reason why is because this is just going in and utilizing GPU only and is utilizing the frequency of the GPU more so than just brute forcing with multiple cores. So you can see that there are time variation there of around 3 seconds. It's still in the single digit, not even in the minutes, but in the seconds. But those are some things to consider. This is the reason why I said in one of my earlier videos for this cycle that if we have the M4 Ultra, this would be a machine that blows everything out of the water, and it would be just awesome for us to get that, where Apple just skipped the M3 Ultra altogether, but that wasn't the case. Here are the rest of the machines in the lineup, and let's take a look at Lightroom. This is version 8.2 to support full acceleration. This is a task that goes in and use CPU, GPU, and RAM in combination. Now, having this 256 gigabytes of RAM doesn't really change the equation in this task much because it's not really going in and maxing out all these RAMs. More so, the reason why you're seeing the time being shorter here is because of the CPU and GPU. More of the CPU and GPU cores are in the system. We're talking about a minute time variation here. If you take a look at the price tag, is it worth it or not? That really depends on where you want to buy into the M4 Max. If you're upgrading, it might be just worthwhile just to bump it up. Here are the other machines in the lineup, and now let's take a look at Capture One, which now goes in and utilizes system resources on both import and export. Thank goodness, we've been waiting for a while for that. So for this, about a minute and a half. As is, I would probably say that this configuration, just stock, is great. But if you're gonna go and bump it up, I really think that the Ultra is making a lot more sense. So just some food for thought there. Here are the rest of the machines in terms of the import time. And even, for example, the slowest one, the M2 Max, we're still talking about a single digit minute. We're not even bumping into like the double digit at all. What about for export? Well, we take a look at this. We're now talking about time variation of a little bit over 2 minutes. And now I would probably say, if you're doing this day in, day out for 1,000 files and everything, it may be worthwhile just to bump it up to here, especially if you're going to upgrade your Max anyway. But if you're just going to get things at stock, I still think that this is a really compelling value. So really think about how much more memory and how much more SSD you're going to upgrade on your machine. If you're going to get as close to as possible to the Ultra, then go with the Ultra, right? It's just a better step up. Here are the rest of the machines. And this one, I've gone in and test all these machines. Now the M4 Pro is pulling in last on this one because there are less GPU core in the system, and this task just go in and utilizes GPU. It doesn't really care how much memory you have. Everything on these machines, the amount of memory is more than enough to run this task. Now let's take a look at Photoshop. For this, I'm using Digital Lloyd Chamber test. We're running these 3 of his tests, and let's first take a look at Photoshop Speed. For all these tests, you're going to see, or majority of them rather, anything that goes in and just utilize the CPU core, very similar to the HDR merge in Lightroom Classic, the M4 generation is going to pull out ahead. Newer architecture, faster single core speeds. But even though it is much faster, we're talking about less than 1 second variation between all of these. You can see that there that even at the most, even at the slowest with the M1 Ultra, we're still only looking at maybe 2 seconds behind, a little bit less than, 2 seconds really. Photoshop Medium, for this we're taking a look at less than a second behind each other, but this is to show some variation in terms of just CPU. And this is a task that can go and run on just CPU just fine. It pretty much for all these machines, it just runs it on memory. There's no need for paging. So this is the reason why you're just seeing the time as is, and it doesn't expand out that much more. All these are about a second, maybe 2 seconds apart, no big deal. Now this one, 56 gigabyte is starting to make some difference because this is now exceeding the amount of memory you have on this machine. Now, if you ask me, if we bump this up, for instance, to like 128 gigabyte, is this going to beat out the M3 Ultra? I would probably say like, yeah, highly probable. It might be a little bit faster than M3 Ultra in this regard. Also, this one is not necessarily the best test, but is a machine that I'm going to be using. Is 256 gigabytes of memory. If we configure this with like the 96 one, I think it might come out a little bit further. But let's take a look at how that may perform in the other chart. So if we configure this with 96 gigabyte, it might come out to like around 16 seconds instead of like 13. And I would still think that the M4 Max Top Silicon with 128 gigabytes of memory upgrade, even though this one have 48 right now, we'll probably slot in somewhere between there at the very top. So just something to think about there, depending on what you want to do. But if you're going to bump it up that high already, again, $300 variation, you're going to see much more benefit in other tasks. All right, Puget Bench in Photoshop. So you can see the score there. A few thousand points difference, not that big of a deal. Here are all the rest of the machines in the lineup. The M4 generation is pulling out ahead, obviously. In fact, all the M4s, including the M4 Pro, is pulling out ahead because a lot of tasks in Photoshop just go in and utilize a single core CPU when it runs these tasks. Encoding and decoding engine. Remember that in the Ultra, we have pretty much double the video encoder engine and also ProRes encoder. So we're going to see more of this, and we also have double the video decoder engine, whereas we only have one in the Max and also 2 in Ultra for the video encoder and ProRes. So something to keep in mind there. So for this one, we can see that the Ultra is clearly pulling out ahead by a pretty good margin on this one. So if you're doing a lot of tasks where you're not just only editing, but you're exporting videos and clips and so forth, you're constantly rendering, this is going to show much more benefit in this regard. Here are the rest of the machine in the lineup. You can see the Ultra still sits at the very top. And even though this M3 generation is not using the faster encoder decoder engine that we see in the M4 generation, that's why you're seeing these M4 Max, even though they are supposed to be clustering up together there, these are a little bit shorter in terms of time. And that's because there has been some upgrade to that. Even though we don't have an upgrade to that, we're still seeing some good significant speed improvement. And this is the same being repeated for HEVC H.265. Pretty much the same thing there, a good significant time improvement. Similar to what I said before, ProRes timing are going to be much closer to each other. And here are the rest of the machine for the ProRes lineup. So for your consideration there for timing. Now let's take a look at AfterEffects. Now for this, I'm using Adobe Benchmark. Some have asked me to do a Puget Bench test. That will be in the next release cycle for whenever the new machine's coming out, probably later this year maybe. Or, we'll do the Puget Bench then. But for now, we're going to take a look at these two, and the timing are not too far apart from each other. So if you're not going to upgrade, I would probably say this is a really compelling option. But if you're going to upgrade anyway, I probably would suggest you go with that, and it's going to be a really great machine. Here are all the rest of the machine in the lineup, and I do understand that there's more to just exporting in AfterEffects than just what I'm showing you right now, but this gives us an idea. All right, Premiere Pro. For this, I am running Puget Bench score, and the timing, and it's less than 1,000, or less than 1,000 points apart. Here are the rest of the other machine in the lineup. I still think it's holding onto its own just fine there. And now let's take a look at Resolve. So for Resolve there, we still have the Ultra coming up at the very top because it's utilizing a lot more of the encoder decoder engine. Here are the other machines in the lineup for Resolve for your consideration there. And there we have it, M4 Max Top Silicon compared to the M3 Ultra base silicon. One thing that I have already said in all these testing is that there are certain tasks that you can go in and add more RAM, and it's not going to make that much of a difference in terms of timing, and the Ultra will still win out. The reason why is because a lot of those tasks just literally go in and utilize the CPU, GPU, or in combination CPU and GPU together, and there are more of them on the Ultra. Whereas on the Max Silicon, you don't have as much. So you can bump in the RAM as much as you want. It's not going to reduce the time by that much. In very few tasks, for example, in like Photoshop Huge, where it is a 56 gigabyte file, bumping the RAM on the Max will probably get you the result that's close to, if not beating out the Ultra very easily. And part of the reason why is because those tasks tend to run on a single CPU core rather than multiple CPU core where you use all of them at once. So really think about the tasks that you do. And the other thing too is, especially if you do video, doubling the encoder decoder engine when you go to the Ultra, I think makes a lot of sense. At least it is to me anyway. I also want to iterate too that Apple have just released a video going behind the scene of Severance, how they were really, or the editor for Severance, and they're using, for instance, Apple MacBook Pro. I don't know if MacBook Air is in there or not. I can't remember. I know they use a Mac Mini for sure, and I'm not sure if it used the M4 or the M4 Pro Silicon, but those can do the job just fine for editing. But one thing for us to all keep in mind that those machines are really capable of getting a job done, that's true. But you're also in a Hollywood workflow where everything is highly compartmentalized, meaning that the editors just really edit and renders on the timeline. They don't do the final render, the final export for uploading to different media, different channel, different streaming, and so forth. And if you're an individual creator like myself or a smaller production studio, that's something that you're going to have to do yourself in-house. And having the speed to get that done faster, I think for me, is personally worth it. So just think about that in the back of your mind too, that the silicons are capable, but that's just looking at one aspect of the workflow instead of everything in a video production. Like I said, the justification for all this is really going to matter where you are in your career. If you've been doing it for some time like me, I just want to get the fastest thing done possible. And for me to go in and really upgrade the Mac Silicon all the way, the price is so close that it's just a much better investment for me to jump to the Ultra. Now, that might not be the case for where you are, especially if you're starting out. These base machines are really amazing. Even if you just get the top M4 Max Silicon, they are amazing machines. And they will be a workhorse for any one of you out there who are just starting out and just want to have a really fast machine to work with. So if you're a new purchaser, you start to have an idea which machine may be good for you. But if you're upgrading, I would take a look at the other machines I have in the chart too. And if you want to see the other machine that goes beyond this, I would highly recommend checking out my full video where I have the compilation of all the other, for example, regular M machines and also the laptop machines too, so you can check that out. But if you're upgrading, really think about what do you need to upgrade. Do you really need to go for that much more of a speed? Because if you have, for example, M1, M2 Ultra, they're still holding their own just fine. They're all under a single digit minute in terms of time variation at this point in time because you are already sitting here at the top end. Upgrade priority still stand true for this one. Started with the memory, going with the chip family, upgrade SSD, and lastly, going and upgrading the silicon variant. But this time around though, when it get this high, we're not really given that much options. So sometimes we just really have to just upgrade to the top variants. For example, we need to get the top M4 Max in order for us to upgrade the RAM in the system. There's no other way about it. So here are the recommendations based on the tasks that you do. Read this across, good, better, best. So Lightroom Classic, Macs are going to be better now because they can go in and utilize the GPU on export. You want to have the best performance, I would go in with Ultra. Photoshop, I would probably say any of the M4 generation, M4 Pro, M4 Max would be great. M3 Max would also be great for that. The Ultra doesn't really factor in there because Photoshop doesn't really use that. So take a look at the predominantly tasks that you do in your workflow. If you're using Capture One, M4 Max, the Ultra now makes a lot of sense, where it didn't before. But I still think a lot of the Max Silicon from M1, M2, M3 generation are still a really great workflow or a really great workhorse that's in the better category for Capture One. And lastly, if you do video, I think Ultra is definitely worthwhile. But if you want to conserve on your budget a little bit and just get stock machine or buy, for example, used or secondhand machine or refurb machine, I think Max across the board are still really great option there. And because we're sitting at the top end, memory and SSD is not going to really make that much of a difference. As far as silicon upgrade goes, the best thing that you can do to utilize this chart is to circle the silicon you're on and just follow the arrows. See how you can upgrade. Interestingly enough, I put that dash line there for the M4 Max. Upgrading the Ultra is not a clear choice winner in all the categories. Where it wins on the Ultra is by a pretty good margin. Now, is it significantly like that much faster, like double the speed? We're not really quite there. So for the most part, I would probably say it really depends. But if you're gonna go in and upgrade the M4 Max like all the way, I think it's worthwhile to consider the Ultra on there. And it's not a bad idea too to consider, for example, you have an M3 Max, M2 Ultra or M1 Ultra is still a really great silicon to consider getting on the refurb, clearance, or like used market. If you can still find them at a really great value, I think that's really awesome. So yeah, here has been the comparison for all of those, and I hope that you get to see the performance of these computers when they're not doing MDR. If you have any questions or comment, leave them below. Give us a like, subscribe, and hit the bell if you're new. I'm Art, and I thank you for your time.